Welcome to Utah Valley University. It's my delight and honor to initiate this really spectacular morning in honor of something very important. UVU has been engaged in celebrating Martin Luther King's life and legacy for over 18 years with a unique cooperation between faculty, staff, students, and administration. It's something that strikes at the core of our institutional values, and let me say just a word about that right now. At UVU, we talk about just doing a handful of things, but doing them very well. We are a very serious institution of higher learning. We take education as of utmost importance in the lives of our students and our community. It's important to study, it's important to read, it's important to learn, and we are grateful for the inspiration that Martin Luther King's life and legacy and that our special guest speaker today offer in terms of underscoring the importance of education, which was always vital in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who went on to earn a Ph.D., and our speaker today, Julian Bond, graduate of Morehouse College and son of a college president. I was just kidding with him earlier. That gives me hope for my children. They might turn out all right. So in both men, we see a wonderful commitment to the importance, the vitality of taking education very seriously. We strive to be engaged with the world around us, to not just be about books and theory and learning and speeches, but to go out in the real world and do stuff. Make a change, make a difference, and that's what we mean by engagement here at UVU, and certainly that's what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did, and Julian Bond is a partner in that effort in an ongoing way, have taken their wonderful learning, they're erudite, they're sophisticated, and yet they know how to enter into the real world, move the masses, make things happen. And finally, we talk about being inclusive, that UVU is a home to all people of all backgrounds, all perspective, different political ideologies, different races, different socioeconomic status. All are welcome on this campus. I believe that's consistent with the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the things that have been carried on in that fight afterwards through Dr. Julian Bond. So it's wonderful to be here. We've been doing this for, as I said, 18 years now, and it's, I think, been a vital part of our campus culture. I want to thank our Martin Luther King Memorial Board of Advisors and working very closely with our key university personnel. I'll say just a word here about Julian Bond before we turn the time over for the remainder of the program. But Julian Bond, as I said, has been involved in the civil rights struggle for more than several decades, since the 60s, where he joined the movement as a student at the Morehouse College in Atlanta. Just to illustrate his commitment to our philosophy of engagement, he came from the airport on Wednesday so that he and his wife, Pam Horowitz, could attend student and faculty panels in the spirit of engagement. He quickly became involved in Q&A sessions and the comment period at the end. This is just the kind of thing we want to have happen. It's that spirit of serious intellectual engagement, but something that inspires us to do better, to make the world better for all human beings, whoever they may be, wherever they may come from. So, Julian, on behalf of the institution, I want to extend a personal welcome to you and say what an honor it is to have you here with us today. We look forward to hearing your remarks, and we'll proceed with the program here. But initially, a warm welcome of applause to you. So.
Thank you, President Holland. Before I introduce Julian formally, we have a special treat this morning. I'd like to invite to the stage Ms. Jeslyn Popwell, who is a vocalist and a graduate from the University of Utah. And she, in the spirit of the commemoration and the struggle for civil and human rights that is the reason why we're here today, Jessalyn is going to sing a couple of verses from the hymn Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the Negro National Anthem, which is about 100 years old today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Jessalyn Popwell. Jessalyn.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast.
Thank you, Jessalyn. Well, again, good morning, everyone, and welcome students and staff and faculty and our good friends who are members of the community here to the third day of the 18th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration. If you have been lucky enough to attend any of the program sessions yesterday or Tuesday, you will agree that we have really offered a rich and diverse menu of topics that celebrate civil rights in many of its historical and contemporary dimensions. Yes, we commemorate the struggle that Dr. King and tens of thousands of others undertook, but more importantly, I think, The dream is really about the journey forward. It has been our goal to get out of our collective memory of Martin Luther King as the slain civil rights leader. This label does nothing more than to pigeonhole him as a figure who belongs to the historical past. As the poet Karl Heinz warned in this poem, "Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him, build monuments to his glory. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images that we would fashion from their lives. And besides, it's easier to build monuments than to build a better world." So we gather today to celebrate the successes and victories of Dr. King, but we also gather to renew our dedication to answer Martin's call for us to continue to extend justice and to flourish. I want to take a second to thank all of the individuals and organizations who worked to make this commemoration happen, who contributed resources and time, who wrote papers and produced works in the creative arts, who judged panels, who staffed tables handing out literature, who provided scholarships, especially those of you on the staff of the Student Center for arranging this gorgeous room that we have today, for providing tech and video and audio assistance, and to dining services in the culinary arts program for the fine nourishment that we've enjoyed. And especially to Julian and his wife, Pam Horowitz, for agreeing to keynote our 18th annual commemoration. Thank you two very much. Julian Bond, the organizations that he has led, founded, joined, been the president of, been a board member of, been a legislator for, got an honorary degree from. Through these organizations, he has inspired millions of us to continue to pursue justice through nonviolent and peaceful means. Julian Bond was born in Nashville in 1940, the son of Dr. Horace Mann Bond, a college president in Georgia and Pennsylvania. Julian graduated from high school in 1957 and enrolled that same year in Morehouse College in Atlanta, where he and hundreds of students throughout the South joined forces to create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. At SNCC, Mr. Bond took on several responsibilities, such as communication director and working on voter registration drives throughout rural Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. Julian was elected to the Georgia legislature in 1965, but he was refused a seat because of his opposition to the American war in Vietnam. In 1966, another election, same result. But after a third election and a ruling by the United States Supreme Court, he was seated and ultimately served 4 terms in the Georgia House and 6 terms in the Georgia Senate. Julian holds honorary degrees from more than 24 colleges and universities and has served on boards for several universities, including Harvard and the University of North Carolina. He served 4 terms on the national board of the NAACP, and from 1998 to 2010, he was the national board chair. His television and movie appearances include America's Black Forum, The Today Show, the PBS series Eyes on the Prize, and maybe best of all, he hosted Saturday Night Live in 1977. Julian's publications include the essay collection, A Time to Speak, A Time to Act. He is author of Black Candidates' Southern Campaign Experiences, and his articles and poetry have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Life, and the LA Times, including many others. His teaching experience includes a Pappas Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania, visiting professorship at Drexel, Harvard, and Williams College, and at present he is Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American University in Washington and Professor of History at the University of Virginia, where he is co-director of the Explorations in Black Leadership project. We have a limited number of copies of the latest book, This Light of Ours, which is a book of kind of a coffee table style book of photographs of the civil rights era, for which Julian wrote one of the introductory essays, and we'll have them available for sale outside in the foyer after the keynote. Should also mention that Julian and Pam will be staying in Utah a couple more days to join the festivities at the Leonardo Museum in Salt Lake, where that photo exhibit is now being displayed. So I know this is a big weekend for film. There's some little film festival here going on in this area. But if you find time to get up to the Leonardo, please go visit those photographs and say hello to Julian again. I will mention that after the keynote, we're going to try to save a little bit of time for Q&A and comments at the end. We'll try to adjourn at 11:15. We'll pick up again at 11:30 at Center Stage, which is just down the hall to the south here, for an informal meet and greet and reception line, so you'll get an opportunity to say hello to Julian and his wife, ask them a couple of questions, when that will last for about an hour. One slight change to the program, and that is one cancellation. At 2:30, the Minority Students Experience panel has been canceled, but otherwise the schedule remains as it is. So with that, friends, it is my great honor to introduce to you Mr. Julian Bond. Julian.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for that warm welcome. It's a great pleasure for us to be here, and we've made a couple of visits to Utah before, but it's always a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to know that in the audience is Jeanette Williams, Jeanette Williams, president of the Salt Lake City branch of the NAACP, and I imagine some of you have had your NAACP memberships lapse. And if that's the case, Ms. Williams will be glad to sign you up again and make sure you're a member of the country's oldest, largest, best civil rights organization, and we'll be glad to sign you up. Now, the title of this talk, How I Got in the Movement, is taken from the title of a favorite sermon of Dr. Martin Luther King's. This is not plagiarism, this is borrowing. It's an old and time-honored tradition. The first time you use somebody else's words, you say, as Dr. King always said. The second time, it's as someone said. And the third time, it's as I always say. So here is How I Got in the Movement by Julian Bond, as I always say. Now, you've heard, what you're going to see is a pictorial history of my involvement in the civil rights movement, and as you just heard, a brand new book of civil rights photos, This Light of Ours, is available in the bookstore down the hall and will be for sale out in the lobby after this program is over. Now, I grew up on university campuses at Fort Valley State College for Negroes outside Macon, Georgia, and on the campus of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Now, this is a photograph, he said, hoping it will be a photograph. Yes. This is a photograph from left to right of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. E. Franklin Frazier, a noted sociologist, and my father, Dr. Horace Mann Bond, and myself on the lower left, and my sister, Jane Bond, taken in March of 1942 on the campus of Fort Valley State College for Negroes, where my father was the first president. These men are dedicating us to a life of scholarship, and my mother to become a mother of scholars. My father was an academic. My mother, Julia Washington Bond, was a school teacher and then became a librarian. My mother's grandmother was a slave. My father's grandmother was a slave too, given away as a wedding present to a new bride. Jane Arthur Bond was my great-grandmother, the daughter of Martha, born in 1828. Her father, Henry Crockett, belonged to the famous Western Virginia family of frontier fame. This is a painting of his famous ancestor. It's not Fess Parker. Jane's two sisters, Charity and Patience, were sold and never heard from again. Her frequent companion was an author daughter, Belinda. When Belinda married a young Methodist minister, Preston Bond, in 1848, Jane was given away as a wedding present and made her home with the Bond family in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, the Anderson County seat. When Preston Bond's wife became pregnant, he fathered two children with his slave, James, born in 1863, and Henry in 1865. Both boys took the surnames of their slave master father, Bond. The 13th Amendment freed Jane, James, and Henry Bond in 1865. These two women, the slave, Jane Arthur Bond, and the mistress, Belinda Bond, were quilters. Curiously, or perhaps not, many of the women in my family have been or are quilters today. Jane was an accomplished quilter. The next two images are pictures of quilts she made. James Bond was my grandfather. He became a civil rights activist. I grew up on college campuses in Georgia and Pennsylvania. This is a picture of my family, mother and father flanking us, my brother James, my sister Jane, and myself. We like names that begin with J. I attended Morehouse College in Atlanta. I was an active participant in the Atlanta sit-in movement, and I'm fortunate enough to have been born in 1940, too soon to be a baby boomer, but old enough to have been eyewitness to and participant of much of civil rights history. I was in Atlanta in February 1960 when the sit-ins began there, and I helped to organize them and was arrested there at Atlanta City Hall for the first time. In early February 1960, I was sitting in a cafe across the street from the Morehouse College campus, a cafe we went to between classes or instead of classes, when an older student approached me, a man I only knew as a Morehouse College football player. He held up a copy of Atlanta's black newspaper, the Atlanta Daily World, and said, "Have you seen this?" I thought he was asking if I read a daily newspaper, and I knew every college student read a daily newspaper, so I said yes. But he meant a story in the paper, Dateline, Greensboro, North Carolina, whose headline read, "Students sit in for the third day." It told how for the third day in a row, college students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro sat in at a Woolworth's lunch counter. It described their demeanor, how they behaved, how they were dressed. It was like a handbook on how to sit in. Yes, I said, I'd seen that story. What do you think about it, he demanded, and I answered, I think it's great. He asked then, don't you think we ought to make it happen here where we are, in Atlanta? And before I could say, what do you mean we? He said, you take this side of the cafe and I take the other, and we'll call a meeting. Within a few minutes, we had interested a cadre of students interested in meeting to discuss duplicating the Greensboro sit-in. And over the next several days, we widened our circle, ensuring we had students from all the Atlanta University schools, not just from Morehouse, a school for men, but also Spelman College for women, Clark and Marsh Brown colleges, both co-ed, the Interdenominational Theological Center, a collection of theological schools, and Atlanta University, a graduate school. There are no secrets on college campuses, as you perhaps know, and word of our plans quickly reached Dr. Rufus Clement, the president of Atlanta University, considered by many the de facto president of the entire university center. He called us into his office. He told us he knew what we were planning to do. He knew he couldn't stop it, but he wanted us to find a way to tell people what we were going to do and what we planned to do. A Spelman student, Herschel Sullivan, and I quickly wrote a document we called An Appeal for Human Rights, based loosely on a pamphlet called The Second Look at Atlanta, a critical look at the contrast between Atlanta's reputation as a racially moderate community and the actual facts of the existence of widespread racial discrimination throughout the city. Dr. Clement, unknown to us, had received a large sum of money from Lillian Smith, a white Georgia author and a racial liberal, whose dramatic novel about an interracial romance, Strange Fruit, had created a scandal across the South. He used that money to place what we had written as a full-page ad in the morning daily paper, the Atlanta Constitution, the afternoon daily, the Atlanta Journal, and the black daily, the Atlanta Daily World. The ads signed by the student body presidents of the several schools created a sensation. It contrasted black and white disparities in Atlanta in housing, healthcare, education, law enforcement, and closed with a warning. We must say in all candor that we plan to use every legal and nonviolent means at our disposal to secure full citizenship rights as members of this great democracy of ours. Georgia Governor Ernest Vandiver said, "This was not written in Georgia. It sounds as if it had been written in Moscow or Peking." That was particularly irritating to me because I've never been to either Moscow or Peking. The Atlanta Civil Rights Movement had many dramatic moments. One occurred when Dr. King himself was arrested at Atlanta's biggest department store and taken to Reidsville State Prison in chains. King's jailing prompted a telephone call to Ms. Coretta Scott King from presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. Kennedy's campaign, without seeking or obtaining permission from the candidate or from Robert Kennedy, the campaign manager, arranged for labor unions to print and distribute 1 million copies of a leaflet called "No Comment Nixon" versus the candidate with a heart, John F. Kennedy. Printed on blue paper, it went down in campaign lore as the Blue Bomb and is considered to have tipped the balance from Nixon to Kennedy. In 1956, Democrat Adlai Stevenson had won 60% of the black vote. In 1960, Kennedy won 80% of the vote. The Blue Bomb made all the difference. Now, these are members of the Atlanta student movement meeting with Dr. King in his office at the Southern Christian Leisure Conference, the civil rights organization he founded in 1957. This is the symbol of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I was one of several hundred students from across the South who gathered in Raleigh on Easter weekend 1960 to found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it was called. And I became the organization's communications director, a position I held for the next 5 years. This is a Richard Avedon picture of SNCC workers in Atlanta. Over its brief life, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee became the most aggressive of the civil rights organizations with the largest staff working in the South. I helped to organize Atlanta's sit-in movement, which successfully integrated the city's lunch counters, parks, and tennis courts, and movie theaters over the next several years. On May 13, 1961, I met with the Freedom Riders as they passed through Atlanta, never dreaming they'd be viciously attacked and beaten, some of them almost fatally, in Anniston and Birmingham the next day. This is the route of the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Riders, like the larger civil rights movement they grew from, forced change through nonviolent action that could not have been achieved as quickly by other means. Like the sit-ins before them, they appealed to America's sense of fair play by challenging segregated transportation at the risk of their lives. This is a Freedom Rider bus outside Anniston, Alabama, after Ku Klux Klansmen cut the tires and set it on fire. The Freedom Riders were successful in forcing the Interstate Commerce Commission to integrate seating on interstate transportation. The ICC order went into effect on November 1st, 1961. These are just a few of the more than several hundred Freedom Riders arrested on the original ride and smaller spontaneous rides that sprung up throughout the country. I was also in Albany, Georgia in 1961, when a movement built by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and then joined and led by Dr. King fought and then foundered. I was in rural southwest Mississippi in 1961 when SNCC established its first beachhead in the most resistant state, and I met a man who was later murdered because he dared to try to register to vote. I was in Birmingham late on the afternoon of the bombing that morning of the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 little schoolgirls. The Birmingham protest and the bravery of young children facing fire hoses and police dogs showed how determined black people were to win their freedom. From beginning to end, the Birmingham movement lasted only a few weeks, but those weeks were filled with drama and heroism brought to Americans nationwide by television coverage. This is a window of the bombed-out church, and this is me standing with a group of friends outside the church. I don't appreciate any comments about my pants length. I was at the 1963 March on Washington where Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Each of the civil rights organizations coordinating the march contributed staff members to the effort. The most venerable organization, the NAACP, was founded in 1909, and they provided their PR director, Henry Lee Moon. His contribution to me seemed to be walking around making pronouncements. My organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was the youngest, and they contributed me, along with others, and part of my job was giving Coca-Colas to the movie stars. I'll forever remember giving a Coca-Cola to Sammy Davis Jr. and hearing him say, "Thanks, kid." This is Sammy Davis Jr. on the left, an unknown journalist in the middle, and the NAACP's executive director, Roy Wilkins, on the right. The March on Washington brought 250,000 people to the nation's capital, the largest demonstration held to that date. This peaceful assembly, the words of the many speakers, the dramatic rhetoric of Dr. King, convinced many of those watching on television of the justice of the marchers' goals. Here's a picture of SNCC people at the march, followed by a picture of me at the march. I'm actually in this picture, but you can't see me, but trust me, I'm there. And here is a group of people, SNCC people, mostly sing at the march. You can see me and Andrew Young, Dr. King's assistant, who spoke here recently, in the middle of the crowd. I was in Selma when that movement began in 1963 in Montgomery, and in Montgomery, in 1965, when the Selma-Montgomery marchers arrived. The Selma movement culminated in the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, thought by many to be the civil rights movement's most important legislative victory. It eliminated the arbitrary and discriminatory barriers to registration that had rendered Southern blacks politically impotent and arguably cleared the way for President Obama's election. Here's a picture of my brother James and I in the now long gone Davis Brothers cafeteria in Selma, watching as Dr. King, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and King's brother, Reverend A.D. King, integrated the restaurant. And in 1965, as the civil rights movement began to shift from confrontational protest tactics back to electoral strategies, I was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. This is a photo of the newly elected black legislators chosen in a special election by court-ordered reapportionment. A federal court had ordered the elimination of Georgia's county unit system, an electoral system much like the Electoral College and making about as much sense. Under the county unit system, Georgia's 159 counties had 410 county unit votes. The 8 most populous counties had 6 votes each. The next 30 most populous had 4 votes each, and the remaining 121 had 2 votes each. So the smaller counties had a majority of the votes, despite making only 1/3 of the population. Here's a cartoonist version of how this system worked. Here's a picture of me looking disconsolate as the legislature voted to expel me 184 to 12. I do look disconsolate, don't I? I seem to have lost a page here. At any rate, after I was thrown out, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee issued an anti-war statement opposing the war in Vietnam, and the result was that my legislative colleagues expelled me and threw me out. The statement we issued was prompted by the murder of one of our colleagues, Sammy Young, who had tried to use the bathroom at a white-owned gas station. Sammy was a Navy veteran and in his Navy service had lost one of his kidneys. And that made him had to go to the bathroom more than most people did. He tried to go to the bathroom at a white-owned service station and the owner shot him in the head and killed him. The irony of a man killed because he lost a kidney in service of his country was just too late. One of my constituents, Dr. Martin Luther King, led a march to the Georgia State Capitol protesting my exclusion, and Dr. King voted for me too. At least that's what he told me when this picture was taken. I ran a 3rd time, and in the interval, the Georgia State Supreme Court decided that the Georgia House was wrong to deny me my seat, and I served, as you've heard, in the Georgia House and Senate for the next 20 years. My case was called Bond v. Floyd, and I was defended in the Supreme Court by my brother-in-law, Howard Moore, and attorney Leonard Boudin. I sat just behind the bar where the lawyers sat in the Supreme Court to watch the argument as Boudin's law partner, with attorney Boudin's law partner, Victor Rabinowitz. And I still remember Justice Byron White interrupting the Attorney General of Georgia, Arthur Bolton. Bolton was trying to argue that Georgia had a right to expel me. And Justice White said, "Is that all you have? You've come all this way and that's all you had?" And I elbowed Rabinowitz and said, "We're winning, aren't we?" He said, "Yes, you are." And we were, and we did 9-0. This was a great step forward for freedom of speech and the right of elected officials to express their thoughts. Now here's some of my campaign literature. Whoop, that's not it. I lived the life of a normal young black person in the 1960s. I did all the things that young people do. it wasn't all just movement activity. I was engaged in athletics too, even in boxing. I was a referee in a fight between Muhammad Ali and Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson, and I counted Ali out when Jackson knocked him out. This was the last of three-round exhibition matches Ali fought that night. I remember during the third round, Ali said to the mayor in a stage whisper, "Hit me, hit me." And I could tell the mayor didn't want to hit him. Ali then threw a punch which stopped fractions of an inch from the mayor's jaw, and his eyes grew larger, and I could see his mind saying, "I better hit him." He did, and Ali fell down. Now here's another picture of me with big hair. But here's a picture of Ali lying on the ground. I gave him the notorious long count, made emphasis in the 1926 fight between heavyweight champion Gene Tunney and former champion Jack Dempsey, and then I held the victorious mayor's hand high. Now this is a class roll from a class taught at Morehouse College by Dr. King, and if you look carefully, you can see my name on that list. So I'm one of the few people, 8 people in the world, who can say I was a student of Dr. King's. You know, a lot of people say that, but if you look at this list and you don't see their name there, then you know that they're not being careful with the truth. Now, I recall sitting in a classroom at my alma mater, Morehouse College in Atlanta. That class was a small seminar, 8 students, and where I'm standing now, 2 teachers sat, Dr. King and the Reverend Samuel Williams. Williams was a local pastor and president of the Atlanta NAACP, and he had taught King when King was a Morehouse College student. The 2 of them co-taught a survey on the great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and all the rest. Most of the weekly classes were devoted to discussions of the civil rights movement, but I didn't have the wit to tape record them, and I can't recall much about them. I do remember that one day, after class was over, Dr. King and I were walking across the beautiful, beautiful Morehouse College campus, and a wonderful moment occurred. I turned to him as we were walking. I said, "Doc, how you doing?" His friends called him Doc. He said, "Julian, I'm not doing well. Segregation is everywhere. Black unemployment is high. Racial conditions seem to be getting worse. I feel awful," he said. "I have a nightmare." I said, "No, Doc, turn that around. Try I have a dream." And of course, the rest is history. I sense doubt. But you know, my word is my bond. I sense more doubt. In 1968, 4 months after Dr. King's assassination, I was in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. I was the co-chair of a challenge delegation from Georgia drawn together to contest the way the state picked convention delegates. 4 years earlier, in 1964, after a bitter fight over the seating of a challenge delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an integrated party built by the civil rights movement in Mississippi, the Democratic Party had promised that all future delegations would be racially integrated and fairly chosen. 4 years later, in 1968, there was no presidential primary in Georgia. All the delegates were handpicked by the party chairman, and in 1968, he picked a delegation that was almost all white. Its membership included people pledged to vote for Alabama Governor George Wallace, a third-party candidate, and not for any of the Democratic candidates. Despite support for Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, none of the hand-picked Georgia delegates was pledged to vote for either one of them. The delegation I headed was chosen democratically in an open convention in Macon. Our delegation fairly represented the Democratic candidates, Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy. By August, Robert Kennedy had been killed. I went to Chicago a week before the convention with Taylor Branch, who coincidentally received the Pulitzer Prize later for his wonderful 3-volume history of the civil rights movement, collectively called America in the King Years. Our job was to secure housing and transportation for our 60-member delegation, hotel rooms for them to stay in, and buses to transport them to the convention center. There's not a room to be had or a bus to be secured. Furthermore, unlike other delegations supported by their state parties, we were challenging the legitimacy of our state's party and their leadership, and we were nearly penniless. We were sadly walking down Chicago streets when a well-dressed black man recognized me and approached us to ask if he could help. We explained our problem. He took us to a hotel we had already unsuccessfully approached, and after a quick conversation with the manager, he secured 60 rooms. We were astounded, but we still had no money to bring our delegations from scattered locations around Georgia to Chicago or to pay for the rooms he had secured. The man suggested I ask his employer, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam, more commonly known as the Black Muslims. We were incredulous. The Muslims were forbidden to vote or participate in politics. They believed in racial separation, not integration. Why would the head of an institution that regularly criticizes all white people as blue-eyed devils want to contribute to bringing an integrated group to a meeting where voting and political participation was the main idea? Nonetheless, our new friend arranged for me to have dinner with Mr. Muhammad in his mansion in Hyde Park, the same home where Louis Farrakhan lives today. After the meal, I explained our problem. Mr. Muhammad asked me to return the next day. After that evening's meal, he surveyed the room full of dinner guests, all Muslims, about what he should do to honor my request. In this patriarchal household, women sat at some tables, men at the others. And he began by asking the women first. No, they said, we don't know this young man. He'll give our money to the white devils. My heart sank. He then surveyed the men, and their reaction was mixed. Some said yes, some said no. He turned to me and said, Mr. Bond, in the Nation of Islam, we listen to the women, but we do what the men say do. And he gave me $3,000 in $100 bills. I wired the money to Georgia, our delegation arrived, and after days of lobbying and arguing, the convention voted to split Georgia's seats, half for us, half for the regular party. Most of the regulars walked out in anger, and the Georgia Loyal National Delegation got to occupy most of Georgia's seats and cast most of Georgia's votes. I've often wondered why Mr. Muhammad did that. Why a man who had built a movement on racial segregation and to withdraw from the country's political institutions, why he had given money to bring a group of black and white Georgians to a political convention. Perhaps he remembered his early years in Georgia with some fondness, or was even then looking forward to the day when the Nation of Islam would shed its opposition to politics and would enter the political mainstream. And at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, I was nominated to be the Vice President of the United States. Here's a picture of me on the convention floor. Obviously, I didn't win. At 28 years old, I was too young to hold the office. Instead, Maine Senator Edmund Muskie became the Democrats' 1968 vice presidential nominee. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has always been interested in me, in whatever I did, and reported on my activity. But they couldn't get my birth date right. I worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly called SNCC, from 1960 to 1965. Here are my colleagues in the SNCC office in Atlanta. I went on to a lifetime of activism in the civil rights, peace, and economic justice movements. I'm going to show you some pictures from my movement activity presented in no particular activity. Here I am at a peace rally in New York City. Here I am with little Stevie and Coretta Scott King. We're giving her a check for $50,000 anti-apartheid work. Here I am when I hosted Saturday Night Live. You may not remember that it used to be a comedy show. With me left to right are Garrett Morris, Dan Aykroyd, and Lorne Michaels. And here I am saying good night with the Saturday Night Live cast. And here I am on television speaking for marriage equality. And here I am in 1981 speaking at a conference of state legislators opposing apartheid in South Africa. And here I am with former Congressman, UN Ambassador, and Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young, and my dear friend Ben Brown. The mayor is saying something funny. And here I am with Jane Lynch, Kelsey Bray, Wanda Sykes, U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein, and Parker Williams at the Human Rights Campaign Annual Gala and Hero Awards. And here I am with Nikki Giovanni at the dedication of this Virginia Civil Rights Memorial. And here I am with my good friend Rick Perry, who, sad to say, dropped out of the presidential campaign just this morning, denying us of another series of gaffes, idiot mistakes, and fun. And here I am with my good friends Quincy Jones and Bono. And here I am at the anniversary remembrance of the killings at Kent State. Let me remind you of what happened there. On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen fired at unarmed students at Kent State University after a protest rally against President Nixon's secret invasion of Cambodia. 4 students were killed and 9 wounded, 1 paralyzed permanently. And here I am with my good friend John McCain. And here I am after my AIDS test. Have any of you been tested? You should be, you know. And here I am with my lovely wife, sitting in the front row here. She's a distinguished lawyer, litigated the biggest sex discrimination case ever argued, and one important Supreme Court decision which made it possible for women to work in contact positions in prisons all over the United States. And here I am, a picture with my good friend George Bush. And here I am with my good friends Will Smith and Jada Pinkett. Oh, no, that's not them. That's my good friend Tyra Banks, my very good. And here I am, let's see what's happening here. Here I'm with a really good friend, my better good friend, Barack Obama. Now, race, however old or recent, is still with us today. It can be seen everywhere around us in our daily lives and in the daily newspapers. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 146% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 447% higher. Rates of death from homicide, 521% higher. Lack of health insurance, 42% more likely. The proportion with a college degree, 60% lower. And the average white American will live 5.5 years longer than the average black American. So this history is very much with us, affecting our politics and affecting our lives in many ways. None of us is immune for it. We're a very different country today than when I was first beckoned into the civil rights movement. That's only because thousands upon thousands of Americans put their bodies on the line for freedom and justice. The civil rights movement I'm so proud to have served in was made up mostly of ordinary people who were called upon to do extraordinary things. Dr. King didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphant march. He didn't speak to an empty field at the March on Washington. There were thousands more marching at his side, and thousands more who were marching long before he was born. Remember them as you remember him. He dedicated his life to freedom and justice and peace. We should well decide to do the same. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I might understand we have time for one or two questions. We have time for one or two questions. So if you'll raise your hand, a microphone will be brought to you so everyone can hear your question. Now let's not have all these questions come at once. Here's one over here on my right, waving his hand.
Mr. Bond, thanks for coming, and I enjoy your comments and appreciate your coming here. I have a statement, then I just have a quick question. I guess I saw you standing in front of that human rights campaign, and that was begun by our own mayor from Salt Lake, Rocky Anderson, of course, and he's now declared his candidacy for President of the United States on the Justice Party ticket. I don't know if you were aware of that, so.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. My question is, I would like to know a little bit about more about the Freedom Riders. I saw the excellent documentary on that, and I'd like to know what was the qualifications and what was the criteria as far. I know that there was white people as well as African Americans on that bus. What was the criteria as far as getting involved in the Freedom Riders ride situation?
Well, the origin of the Freedom Riders was at a 1940s Freedom Ride, which was not called a Freedom Ride. It was called the Journey of Reconciliation. It was put together by a pacifist organization, and the main qualification was to be a pacifist, to be committed to nonviolence. And a small interracial group of men, no women, rode from northern cities into the south. I don't think they got below North Carolina. Along the way, they were arrested. Bayard Rustin was one of the, whose name may be familiar to some of you, was one of the riders, and he spent a month in jail, but nothing much was accomplished by it. Later, the second Freedom Ride, which I showed pictures of the people arrested, the criteria was to be brave, to be willing to travel from Washington, D.C., where the initial group of Freedom Riders went, from Washington, D.C., ideally to New Orleans, Louisiana, but they never got beyond Jackson, Mississippi, and along the way they were terribly beaten, some with permanent damage done that they've never been able to recover from. So The real qualification was to be committed to nonviolence and to be willing to risk your life. And we're so fortunate that about 1,000 people did that. And those pictures I showed you, came from a great book about the freedom, a picture book about the Freedom Riders. I can't think of the name of it, but any decent bookstore will have copies of it. There's another great book about the ride itself. This is just a great history in our nation's history, a great moment in our nation's history, because it shows how a small group of committed people can create great change if they're willing to risk and risk and risk. And these people were willing to risk, and we all owe something to them. Because if you take a bus now from Salt Lake City to Birmingham, Alabama, you can sit any place on the bus you want to. And we owe that to them. Another question? I see one way in the back. Why? They're deliberately being far apart.
Well, thank you again for coming. I had a question, is that I was curious about how much you have been able to collaborate with other civil rights movements, such as the American Indian movement, women's rights movement. I know that for a lot of people, what comes first to mind is images of Martin Luther King and many African Americans leading the civil rights movement waves. But my own father, who is Navajo, he was at Alcatraz, and he also went to Brigham Young University, and as a student tried to influence different policies, university policies there. So I was interested. I never had this chance to ever ask someone who was so involved in civil rights movement, maybe if there was any collaborations, or how you think you influenced maybe one another with all these other variety of movements too going on.
That's a great question. Think about the civil rights movement as a collection of organizations and a collection of individuals. On the organizational level, there generally has been fairly good cooperation between black civil rights organizations like the NAACP, for example, and Hispanic, Native American, women, and on down the line. There's generally been good cooperation between organizations representing different interests and the black civil rights movement. As for individuals, the same is true. In Salt Lake City tomorrow, one of the photographers who is in this book is named Tomio Wakayama. He's not German. He is a Canadian and came south to work in the civil rights movement as a photographer. And when he went home to see his family and then tried to return, the United States government would not let him back in the country. He can come now and has been many, many times. But there was this hostile picture that our government had of Asians that kept him from coming to a place where he had done nothing but make a contribution to making it a better country. So this kind of cooperation was fairly widespread. There were other Asians who worked in the civil rights movement. A good friend of mine named Ed Nakawatase, whose parents were in a concentration camp during the Second World War, and whose father never learned to speak English because he had such enmity for the United States, treating him in this way. And there's just occasion after occasion after occasion where you see cross-racial and cross-cultural contributions made together. So this really is a history of people of different faiths, different races, different ethnicities, different origins coming together for common cause. It's a noble and an ennobling story.
Dr. Bond?
Yes.
I wanted to ask kind of a mundane question, I'm sorry, but I wonder how this was paid for, if people were paying for their own efforts or if there were donors, because here at UVU, as instructors and professors, we're trying to stimulate community service and engagement in these kinds of issues. We have 47% of our students working more than 30 hours a week just to sustain their own lives, and I'm just wondering, could you explain how people even stayed in school while they were doing this, or how they funded being in and out of town and that sort of thing? It's sort of, I'm sorry for the mundaneness of it, but when we're trying to inspire people to do this, we have to explain this to them.
That's a good question. And the answer is that the money came from many different ways, different sources, and in many different amounts. The organization I work for, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, paid poverty levels salaries. I was the highest paid employee because I was married and had children. I made $40 a week. This is in the 60s, and that was not quite a livable wage. We also got money from wealthy individuals who are sympathetic to our cause. We got money from foundations. We got money from labor unions. And the same is generally true of all the other organizations. The NAACP, where I served as chairman for 11 years, depended first on a network of members around the country, ordinary people who paid, today it's $30 a year to be a member of the NAACP, and who made contributions as they were able to the national organization to enable it to carry out its work. But again, foundations, labor unions, wealthy individuals, some corporations supported it, but none of these organizations has ever had enough money. None of them ever had enough money. And they've had to scuffle and beg and borrow, never steal, but come close to it, to make sure they could pay their staffs, could keep their offices open, and do all the other things that any organization needs to do. So it's always been a struggle for them, but they've always been able to get by and depend on the generosity of Americans to support this work. I hope that answers it.
I have a question. I would like to hear your critical reaction to the book and/or the film, The Help.
I loved it. I thought it was a wonderful book. I didn't read the book. I thought it was a wonderful movie. I saw it twice. I saw it for the first time at the NAACP convention in Los Angeles in July. The NAACP likes to have its conventions in the hottest month, in the hottest city if we can find one. We're going to Houston this year. Anyway, they had a showing of the movie The Help, and attending the showing were the director, the woman who had written the book, and two of the stars, the woman who played Minnie and the woman who played the mean white woman. And each of them talked to us after the movie, and the mean white woman said that she told her mother, I'm playing, what's her name? Hilly. She said, I'm playing Hilly. I'm going to play Hilly in the movie, because her mother had read the book. And her mother said, that fits you so well, dear. I thought it was a great movie. It wasn't the greatest movie I've ever seen, but I thought it was a wonderful movie, and I frankly could not understand the criticism heaped upon it by the black literati, black people who said that it was demeaning to have black women playing maids. Of course, this is a true life story. I mean, the events didn't happen as spelled out in this fictional book, but these things did happen. Black women were maids. This was a noble profession, some supporting families sending children off to college, and I think the movie told that wonderfully, and I liked it a great deal.
Mr. Bond, I wanted to ask you a question about the peaceful movement that you had. Was there any, was there a balance, or how, what my question is, with the peaceful side of things, the Black Panther movement and those kinds of groups, did that ever deter what you were trying to do, or did you work with them? How'd that mix, that blend work for that era?
Toward the end of the life of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we had an alliance with the Black Panther parties. Black Panther Party, that didn't mean that we adopted everything they believed in or that they adopted everything we believed in, but we had enough common interests to make common cause. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was always what its name said, always believed in nonviolence. Now, most of the people did not believe in nonviolence as a way of life. In other words, if they're walking down the street and somebody hit them, they'd hit them back. But almost all of them believed in nonviolence as a tactical effort. If you were at a protest, at a march, at a demonstration or something, you would adopt nonviolence as a tactic and try to adhere to this as best you can. It's not easy to do, but so there's not an occasion in the nonviolent civil rights movement where anyone engaging in nonviolent activity couldn't do it and hit back at someone. As far as I know, there's not an occasion where that ever happened. And so it's a remarkable testimony to the people who did it, because, you know, you just try to do nothing when I come down there and hit you. How you feel? Will you hit me back? Yeah, see? So I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Forewarned is forearmed.
Mr. Bond, thank you again for coming. It's been really neat to hear from your perspective what things you went through in order to get this this going and this movement done. But I wanted to ask, obviously going to school now is a little bit different than it might have been in the past. But racism and inequality for many are still in existence. And I just wanted to know, what do you think we could be doing to further promote equality in our schools today?
Well, you know, the odd phenomenon I see at every school I've taught at, every college I've taught at, is the white students all sitting at the white tables. Now, if you talk to them about it, they say, no, it's not us, it's the black students sitting at the black tables. But why are all the white tables populated by white kids? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center. They have an operation called Teaching Tolerance, and one thing they do is have a day called Mix It Up. This is aimed at high school students. Go to their website and you can find out about it. Called Mix It Up, when high school students are encouraged to sit at the lunchtime with someone not like themselves. And they've done it in increasing numbers of high schools around the country every year. Now, this is a small thing, but it's an important thing. And if you can accustom people at that age to cross barriers that they were afraid to cross or thought they could not cross, I think it's a little step forward. And there are just innumerable organizations, the NAACP, only one of them, innumerable organizations that you can join, and each of these has a pretty well thought out program of what to do to advance the cause of racial justice. And, you know, I always meet people who say, I'm going to start my own organization. I tend to be against that. I think we have enough organizations. Maybe if you can find something that's doing something nobody's doing, okay, but I bet you if you look hard, you can find somebody who's doing what you want to do or what you want done and join them. So I'd suggest you do that.
Mr. Vaughn, in reference of your statistics that you stated earlier about, about the percentages being less of African American students and the degrees, the statistics you gave earlier, graduating from college and jail, things like that, what would you say would be, in a nutshell, what you think should be done to better those percentages? That was my first question. Second, out of all the famous people you've met, who do you think has been most influential, or who are you most gladdest to have met? I can probably guess, but just thought I'd ask.
Well, let me answer the second question first. Probably, of course, Dr. King. I can't say we were best friends or we hung out together. And I knew him primarily from his teaching this class that I attended. But he was such an ennobling figure, or someone who seemed to me to have everything going together correctly. Had a life plan, had made a commitment to social justice, had developed a way to go about it in such a wonderful way. It was just admirable to be close to him and around him. So I'd have to say Dr. King. And in answer to the first question, what was that again? What to do about these things? Well, about the rate of incarceration, we need to seriously rethink the war on drugs. Seriously rethink the war on drugs. It doesn't make sense. Drug addiction is a medical condition. And it doesn't make sense to lock people up because they have a medical condition. So that's the main reason why so many black people are behind bars, because of this foolish war on drugs that we've persecuted for so many years, with almost no effect at lessening the amount of drugs taken by people or sold by people anywhere. So that's one thing. We can do a great deal more about our criminal justice system, which obviously is full of biases. I just saw a statistic that in New York City, enough black men have been stopped and frisked without being accused of any crime of any sort, to have argued that every black man in New York City has been stopped and frisked by policemen once. That's not true. The numbers is as if every black man in New York City has been stopped and frisked. This happens primarily to young people, but why should it happen at all? If in 900 out of, or 1 out of every 1,000 persons turns out to have some prosecutable reason, isn't that speak to a failed strategy? It does to me. So there are many, many things you can do to whittle these things down, these statistics down, increase the educational opportunities for people of color, increase the ability of people of color to live where they choose or where they'd like to. You know, housing segregation is an enormous problem in the United States, and it's one we have paid the least amount of attention to. And you know what happens if all the black people are located over here in this station here? They're segregated from the best jobs, the best schools, the best opportunities, and their opportunities are never going to increase as long as they have to live over there. If they're allowed instead to live all over here, their chances of life improvement increase. So there are many, many things you can do.
My question for you, well, I'm very happy that you came down here to take the opportunity to talk to us. My question is, have there ever been any deaf students or colleagues or anybody who had worked with you in the NAACP? Or if you know you have worked with any deaf?
My grandmother was a teacher in the Tennessee School for the Colored Deaf, because, you know, they had to have separate schools for the colored deaf and the white deaf. And I'm sure this is true for the non-seeing white and colored. And you would think for them it'd make the least difference. But I think there have been deaf members of the NAACP, and at one time, and I don't know if this is still true, they had formed a kind of a caucus to see if they couldn't press issues that they thought were peculiar to people of color who were deaf. And I don't know if that still exists or not. But just as people who cannot hear or who cannot see are spread throughout the society, you find them spread also within these organizations. Thank you.